This is Marilyn Miller from the Scott County Historical Society with Scott Holt from the SCHS Beaver Broadcasting Network. And we're with Joyce and Jerry Wiechman in their home, August 12th, 2016. So we'll turn it over to them to tell their story.
Yeah, I'm Gerald Wiechman, Jerry, for a nickname I've had ever since some teacher in school started calling me that. Age 87, born October 9th, 1928 in Garden Plain, Kansas. That's in Sedgwick County, near Wichita. I've made my home in Scott County, Scott City, since my parents moved here in 1929 from Sedgwick County. My parents are John and Hilda Cook Wiechman. They farmed and purchased a farm, 3/4 of a farm, north of Scott City, 4 miles. And I'm not positive on that, but I think I just paid $15 an acre for it at that time. And kind of unusual for a contract, but their payments was half of the grain crop each year. And half of this land was in grass at the time, so the payments couldn't have been very big when you only get a half of the grain crop off of those farms. But it did work for them, and they got it paid off in the early 40s. One thing about the payments, if you didn't raise much, they didn't get much. And I remember my dad saying at the time, well, all it did was pay the interest on the note this year, but it was a good contract for them, where a lot of people had a set amount they had to pay each year. So they'd come up with a good contract for that. My family includes brothers Marvin, Martin, Donald, sisters Geneva Farrow, Luella Erskine, Lavera King, and Bella Ridio. I lost my brother Martin in World War II, pretty close to the end in '43, and he is buried in Mygrotten, Holland, which we were able to go over there a few years ago and visit the grave along with my brother Don and his wife. What a beautiful setting the graveyard was, which is in Holland. Really enjoyed the trip and so forth, and what a beautiful setting that graveyard is. My family is a German background. My grandparents on both my mother and dad's side come to the U.S. as children. My dad's family settled in Cheney, and my mother's family settled in Haven. They met through Lutheran church functions, and they both attended as young people at that time. Haven and Garden Plain is probably only about 10 miles apart, and they'd done a lot of things through the church at that time. Churches and schools, the big functions they had for get-togethers at the time, and we may not have as much of that today as we did at that time, but it really was to that point in time. I started school in District 11, the country school, and later to elementary school in high school in the Scott City, graduating with the class of 1946. I did not go to college, but started farming with my father in 1946. My favorite teachers that had a suggestion on having here, my first storm was Mrs. Storm. I can't think of his name.
Virgil.
What?
Virgil, or Vernon Storm.
Well, anyway, he had asthma, and they moved to Arizona for his health conditions. And after we retired, I decided that being they moved to Arizona, I would try to see if they're still there. Austin Storm was his name. And so I got the phone book, I found her number and called her up and asked her, I says, do you remember me as a child going to school under you? And she says, yes. She says, I'll still take the newspaper from there. And when I come run across the name of Wiechman, I look it up and see who it is. And she says, I remember all you kids. She said, I had several of them in the school at that time. Probably not the older ones, but the ones close to my age that she had taught. This was a country school with one teacher, and we probably had 16 students and taught 8 grades, which is kind of normal for that time in life. So another teacher was Henry Mooney, which was probably my guide in school to try to keep me lined out, to keep me from going to prison. Because we were a little bit ornery. There was 3 of us in school that kind of caused lots of mischief in school, and he'd set us down and straighten us out once in a while. The other was Coach Reed we had for football at that time, and enjoyed working under him. In school, the biggest thing that I loved in sports was football, although I did play basketball and run in track. And in football, my highlight was I played a guard, and my highlight is on Thanksgiving Day in 1945. I come through the line and hit Clint Dodge of Dighton and knocked the football loose and recovered it over the goal line for a touchdown, give us 6 points. And we went on to win the game 6-0, the first time we had beat Dighton in 13 years. And so that was a highlight for me in my football career, to think I scored a touchdown. But that was good memories. Doing lots of chores at the home at that time, and being kids, as families all had to work in the family to make a go of it. We had big gardens. We milked up to 30 cows in my time at home, and sold cream and eggs, which we took to town. And Saturday evening was a big time for farmers at that time. Our grocery stores and merchants stayed open till 11 o'clock at night on Saturdays, and people would visit, would come, and you'd see them up and down the street, leaning on the cars and what have you, visiting and so forth. Some people would come early to get their car parked on Main Street to get a place to visit and so forth. And of course we had the Majestic Theater. Then a lot of us would attend the particular show and so forth at that time. And the big thing we had at that time was Gene Autry and Hopalong Cassidy and the big cowboys. So naturally, as kids, we had to play cowboys as Gene Autry and Hopalong Cassidy, and of course there's always cowboys and Indians. Maybe that's not very good to say, but that's what it was at that time. Cowboys and Indians we played. In October 2nd of 1949, I married Joyce Wicker, Scott City at the Holy Cross Lutheran Church. I had met Joyce as she was a freshman in school and I was a senior. And she got up, and as a initiation, they had her sing, and she sang Ashton Peak of Santa Fe. Am I right on that?
Yes.
And I thought, well, boy, isn't that something a girl that age can sing that good and so forth. And of course, she was a good-looking girl too, you know. And so, at that time, I began to chase her at that time, and we met at a dance, and danced with her. And of course, dancing continued to be a big thing in us. With after our high school games, local games, why the American Legion Hall at that time had a dance floor, and they always had a Nickelodeon, and the kids could go up there and dance afterwards. And we had 2 or 3 girls that took their pride in teaching the boys to dance. And do you remember the names of some of those girls, Joyce?
No.
Well, I don't remember right now.
Clarabelle Ryan brother was one.
Yeah, Clarabelle Ryan, which was a classmate of
She was
mine.
Rice was her maiden name.
Yeah, but that was a lot of fun, and we had Costy's, which was a little restaurant that Mrs. Costello put in, and it was just a place for the kids to hang out. She had a little bar for serving the soft drinks and so forth, and a little place if you wanted to dance. Why, that was there too, and that was quite an entertainment for kids at that time. Costy's Corner, I believe she called that. But that was great. My dad had one of the first irrigation wells in Scott County, and it was right after the Filsons next door had drilled theirs, and then Dad drilled his. And at that time we felt we needed electricity to run the wells, and REA was going at that time, and they were willing to drill or to build another 3/4 mile line to our farm so we could put down an irrigation well and use electricity to run it. In my time, I drilled my first well in 1956, and over the years I drilled 6 more wells as acquired land and developed it. And the thing about developing land, we did a lot of land moving or dirt moving to level the land for irrigation, and through the Soil Conservation Service, I learned how to do that myself. In the later end, I did most all that myself by learning. I didn't go to college, but I took lessons under college graduates, let's put it that way, and they taught me how to do it, and I done a lot of it myself after that. Going back to irrigation, we started with irrigation ditches made with a ditcher, which was just land ditches, and irrigation tubes. Learn how to start the tubes and pumping them and so forth, and get them started and so forth. And from there I went to aluminum pipe for irrigation, and of course we put in some underground pipe to reach different points to hook the irrigation aluminum pipe to irrigate with. And from there we developed into sprinkler irrigation, and this was all over the time to make better use of our water and also conserve irrigation water at that time. When we started farming, we took over my father's farm, which him and my mother had moved to town at the time, and Joyce and I took over the homestead there, and started in with a small cow herd that I had purchased the calves and had them bred, and kind of started on that, and milked cows and sold eggs, same as our father. And as I developed irrigation, I decided I had to get rid of something, so I got rid of those dad-burned cows. And after a few years, the chickens went with them. And but it was a living. You did those things. Another thing we produced was we had laying hens that were crossed with a black giant rooster, and these eggs were sold to a hatchery in Garden City, and that was a pretty good income and lasted through the spring, and produced Oscar white chickens. I don't suppose very many people know what I'm talking about, but it was at that time it was a chicken that was a good laying hen and worked great. We finally, through the years, why I started to raise cattle during the winter, a winter program, feeding silage and using wheat pasture and so forth on cattle and run them during the winter and always sold them in the springs, and then I'd go back to farming at that time, and it worked pretty good. And from that we finally developed into running cattle the year round, building a feedlot in the early 60s, and went into full feeding cattle then finally, and run cattle year round, and which was quite a feat for learning how to do all that, and keeping enough help to run that operation. And we finally got the feedlot to 5,000 head. Very seldom we ever fed 5,000, but it would hold 5,000 head, and we probably fed more 3,500 to 4,000 head most of the time through that in the later years. Going back to when we were kids, something was what we did for entertainment and so forth. It seemed like us kids played outdoors an awfully lot, even during the wintertime. We would go out and play outdoors. And one thing I remember stuck in my mind, we'd take a plaster slat, which was a little piece of board about 1.25 inches wide and 1.25 inches thick, and usually 3 foot long, and we cut off 7 inches or 8 inches of it, nailed it on the bottom, which would be a T. And that T, we had rings that come off of wagons that were probably about 8 inches around, and you could put them on the ground and rub that thing on the back and stir it around those rings, and you got so you could make those rings go any place you wanted to go with them, which was a lot of fun on us kids. And we did a lot of playing in the dirt with toys and making roads, and we had names for various farms. You could go to this farm or that farm, and had little roads in the ground. Things that we did at that time. Played a lot of games, hopscotch, Red River, come right over, and different games like that we played, especially with families when they come over. We had more people. We loved traveling in a motorhome, which we belonged to 2 different motorhome clubs, and traveled a lot with them. And even when we retired, we used the motorhome to on quite a few of our trips to Arizona, stayed in them, RV parks, until we finally bought a home in Arizona, where we spend our winters now, and really enjoy it. I went into golf when I retired and wasn't very good at it, but I did win a trophy finally, and very proud of that. Later on, through my life and time, I served on a lot of board. I served on, to start with a country school board for a while, and then a water board, Scott Co-op board, Kansas Livestock, production credit, and Park Lane Nursing Home board. And I finally got off of that so I could go to Arizona during the winter. And I guess our next big project then was 1986. We had an all-school reunion. This first one we had in the community. And Joyce and I was asked to chair that thing in 1986 and also 1990 and 95. Talk about a big chore of how many people did we have come in for the first reunion? Do you
Couple
remember?
thousand.
1,000 outside people come back home for all school reunion. Since then it has toned down quite a little bit. But to entertain that many people coming to Scott City and putting entertainments, and making places for them to meet, and furnishing food for a couple occasions and so forth. So quite a undertaking for us, for a couple of country kids to work on. But it was very enjoyable. We learned more about former students, when they graduated, what class they were in, and so forth. And it's amazing how you put that all together then, and lots of enjoyment on that things. Back to our farm. Our farm now is run by two sons, Jay and Norman, two grandsons, Eric and Brian. Eric and Brian work in the farm, and Jay's kind of overseer of the whole thing, but mostly feed yard. And Norman works wherever they need him because he's the fix-it man. And you got to have a fix-it man wherever you do. And so that's his big, and he's still doing that today, fix it. Probably out there today, fixing something. And my biggest job anymore is running around checking rain gauges because I got to know where it rains and how much. And I've been known by some of the RVers that when it rained when they were there, we entertained them here one time in Scott County, and we had a rain, and I had to drive around to 3 different rain gauges and check them, and they said, "Are you serious about checking rain gauges? Who cares if it rains?" I said, "That's my life, rain. Without rain, I don't make a living." So that's still my main job, run around checking rain gauges. I'd like to add a couple things of history. I was only 3 years old, and that's as far back as I can remember anything. But the flood of '31 that took out the dam at the state park, Dad was summoned to come help a neighbor west of the farm on the Ladder Creek or Beaver Creek, as a lot of them call it, to help move some machinery and so forth out of the creek bottom because it was flooding. And they had a shed down there that kind of reached over the edge of the bank or something where they had hogs in. Now this is a part I remember. They cut a hole in the roof, and they was handing these little pigs out through the roof, and I'd hear them squeal, and I could still hear them squeal today. And I couldn't understand why they were hurting those little pigs. Now, that's quite a memory. And another thing, back in the dirty 30s, the big blow that we had in 35, I think it was, we could see it coming, and we knew pretty well what was going to happen. And so my mother said, "We've got to try to get the chickens in or they'll blow away." And I didn't know quite what she meant. But we trying to herd those chickens in, and you can imagine try to get chickens in a chicken house in daylight. And we got a lot of them in, and pretty soon the wind come up and blew, and actually it rolled those chickens just rolled them over and over again, those that stayed out. I think they understood what we were trying to do then. But that was a couple of highlights in history that I remember happening.
Jerry, you might mention the Jim Spangler's.
Jim Spangler was a neighbor of ours. He lived 3/4 miles south of us. And this is when they had the infantile paralysis. Jimmy had infantile paralysis, and of course was quarantined, and we could never go over there. But we used to go with the Spangler kids, the beings are that close, play with them and so forth. And after he'd got over this, Jimmy couldn't walk, but we'd go over there, and we had a bicycle, and we'd go over there, and Jimmy wanted to ride the bicycle so bad, so we put him on the bicycle and push him. And well, his legs was quite a problem, so we tied his legs to the pedals so he couldn't get them off. And he would try to pedal in, and then he'd slow down, and we'd push him again to get him going, and then slow down and push him again. And Dr. Palmer was the doctor at that time, and he happened to come out and check on him at that time, and he seen that. And he said, "If you kids keep doing that, Jimmy may walk again someday." And he did. And that's quite an accomplishment in life to think that we had helped a neighbor like that. Flood in '51, of course, we were living out north of town, and the highways be covered with water where there was a low spot, or what we call a lagoon, and the highways went down through them. And it got over the highways. You couldn't go to Dayton, you couldn't go to Garden City, and couldn't go to Oakley through our big lagoon south of our farm, about a mile. And so they would come to our farmstead and go 2 miles west, and then south, and they could make it to Scott City. And we had a neighbor over there named a plumber, and he would take his tractor and pull people through a spot that they always got stuck in. But when sundown come, he said, "That's it. I'm not pulling anymore till morning." And kind of a funny thing, this Thompson family, I knew her. Do I want to say Georgia Thompson? Do you remember her name? Anyway, no, that was a classmate, Georgia Thompson. Anyway, when we were in Arizona, they come to us and they said they'd like to have a little kind of a music for this reunion they're having. I think it was their 50th wedding anniversary. And they said they'd like to have a little music, and I asked Joyce if she could play for it. I think that was one of her first times she played for anything. And so she agreed to play for it and so forth. And as we got into it, this name wasn't Thompson, it was something else. And when I got to looking at her and so forth, and I asked her what her maiden name was, she says Thompson. And I said, "Is there any chance you lived a mile west and about 3 north?" She said, "Yes, I lived there." And I said, "Do you remember the Wiechmans?" She said, "Well, yes." And I said, "Well, isn't that a coincidence? And after all these years, I find somebody like that, you know." And that was really an interesting thing to get into, yeah, really was.
Yeah, my name is Joyce Wiechman. I'm 85 for a few days yet. And I've been at home in Scott City and Scott County since October the 20th of 1942. I was born on a farm 8 miles southeast of Norton in Norton County, Kansas, August the 18th, 1930. My parents were Fay E. and Ollie Murphy Wicker, who were natives to Norton County. We lived on the farm, and so we had lots of animals that we had as pets, and like Jerry mentioned, you know, you made your own entertainments mostly, because money was just kind of something people talked about but didn't have any very much of. And they were very tough years about then. That was during the dirty 30s, and it was really a tough time for my parents. I'm sure I didn't at that age realize the importance of it, but it was a very, very tough time for them. But one of the things that was really maybe important to us and unusual to some families, we had lots of music at our house. My mother played piano, and my dad played violin. And when my brother was 9 years old, he started playing the banjo that was handed down from a family member. And to help with the income of the family to subsidize the farming, they played dances in the neighborhood and around in the area. And the 3 of them got $6 for playing an evening's work, which was quite a little bit at that day and time. I had one brother, Wayne L. Wicker, and one sister, Irma Lee Lewson. My mother lost 2 babies, so I was the 5th child. My mother's people were Irish on her dad's side, going back to the old country, and her mother's people were Rhineland German. Now after they came to this country, they called them Pennsylvania Dutch, but actually they weren't Dutch at all. They were German, so it was Deutsch, and they just didn't understand that there was a difference between Deutsch and Dutch. And my dad's people, his mother was mostly English. They traced back to England. And in my dad's side, it went back into the Indian even. My grandfather was a Civil War veteran from Indiana. And our name was originally Wichker. And somewhere along the line, he decided the H was not necessary. So from that time on, it was Wicker. I went to the first grade in country school, and we walked 2 miles to school. And like they always say, you know, the wind was in your face both directions. You know how that old story went. And then late in 1937, my folks were forced by the bad years and so on to move into town, into Norton. So I started the second grade then in the school system in Norton. And then in October of 1942, my dad took a position. I think he went to Phillipsburg to get the job. But anyway, it was with the Kansas-Nebraska Natural Gas Company, and which was the plant 4 miles west of Scott City, and that was in October of 1942. And he came in July and stayed here in a rooming house until housing could be arranged for the family. And then my mother and my sister Ermelie and I came in 1942, the 20th of October in 1942. My brother by that time had been drafted into the service and was in the Army. So we started to school in Scott City then at that time. I graduated from SCHS with the class of 1949, and during my school years I enjoyed the music part of it. I played in the band and sang in all of the vocal groups, and Triple Trio was one of my favorites. And then I enjoyed Mrs. Hepler's sewing class. Mrs. Costello, Jerry mentioned her putting in the Costies hangout for the kids. She was our English teacher in high school, and she was tough as nails and made it rough on all of her students, really. But she was always one of my favorites, and I always liked her. And in April of 1949, just before graduation, a high school classmate and I decided to start training with Southwestern Bell Telephone Company, and we became telephone operators. So that was a really good job for that time. You know, the salaries were quite good, especially for girls. Then in October the 2nd of 49, I married Gerald E. Wiechman at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Scott City. Our attendants was my sister Ermelie and Jerry's brother Donald. Our reception was held at the newly redecorated Robinson Coffee Shop. At Mrs. Robinson's insistence, my mother had cooked for the Robinsons in the coffee shop since 1942 when we came to town. And they were getting ready to reopen it. They had to close it during the war because it was so hard to get meat and canned food and so on, so they opted to close it for a while, and then they had just gotten it redecorated, and which just before they reopened. As Jerry mentioned, after we were married, his parents moved to a home in town, and so the farm home 4 miles north of Scott City was our first home. Gordon and Jay and Norman were born while we were living there. But in April of 1959, we moved into our new home, which is across the road south and on a quarter of land that Jerry had purchased. I was very involved with the farm chores, helping Jerry when needed, and raised a big garden and chased little boys. And in 1976, we moved to a new home on Crescent Street in Scott City. And there, by that time, I became very involved in volunteer projects. Some were connected with our sons, and some were church related, and some community related. I was on the organizational board of the Scott County Hospital Auxiliary, and later on the organizational board of the Scott County Healthcare Foundation. And some of my hobbies were oil painting and ceramics. And my oil painting, a lot of it I accomplished. I had my table all set up in the basement, so I didn't have to put anything away but my paint. And when Jerry was chasing cattle in blizzards and running combines till midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning, why, I had a lot of time to paint. Of course, that was in between taking meals to the field, you understand. And I also directed the choir, our church choir, for 11 years. I taught Sunday school, VBS, and helped with fundraisers for band trips and all the things that moms do. We all learned a lesson on how fragile life can be. We lost our son Gordon to melanoma cancer in 1995. So that put our operation at the farm in a real tailspin for a time until, when we eventually worked ourselves out of it, but it was tough for a while. And now Gordon's two sons, Eric and Brian, are part of our family operation. As Jerry mentioned, we really enjoyed our retirement years. The most meaningful, as he mentioned too, was the trip to Europe. We cruised the Rhine with Donnie and Marlo to visit his brother Martin's gravesite in Holland, which it was very, very impressive. We were just amazed at how beautifully it was manicured to the nth degree. It was just gorgeous. And we enjoyed our travels overseas, and a lot of trips to some with our neighbors down south. We took 2 or 3 overseas trips, and then of course our motorhoming trips was always enjoyable. Now we just mostly we spend our winters in Mesa, Arizona, and enjoy being part of our grandchildren's lives and our great-grandchildren that we enjoy very much. We count our blessings, because at our age and being able to do the things that we do is kind of phenomenal, really. And then to be able to do it together with the two of us. And it's kind of like George Burns always says, we don't buy green bananas. So we hope you enjoy our story, and we thank you.